Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
It's called STEM. It stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. The push for advancements in these fields was spurred in the late 1950s with the space race and the Cold War. The first decade of the 21st century, STEM jobs grew 3 times faster than other occupations. In our studio this morning is Dr. Michael Scott. He's Dean of the Henson School of Science and Technology, which oversees the program on the campus of Salisbury University. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So let's go back just a little here because I can remember when the Soviets sent up a satellite and there was suddenly this rush to develop our technological capabilities. Describe a little bit about this effort that seems to grow out of that and just sort of picks up speed.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So that time period was critical. There was a huge growth in engineering programs, mathematics programs, because there was a real desire, obviously, not only to beat the Soviets, but was also a time of great expansion in terms of scientific capability. And so it was an extremely exciting time. High school teachers were really getting into it, and then we felt that at college. One of the largest groups of faculty hired at Salisbury University was directly after that time period when we had a huge move of students wanting to get into science fields.
So what does that then mean in terms of developing these kinds of skills, especially in a field that, as we were talking about a moment ago, is constantly changing?
Right. Well, that is a challenge. So you always have to, and I know the faculty at SU and our Henson School are always trying to figure out how to keep up with the changing technology. It's a challenge. The good news, though, is a lot of the scientific principles that we'll end up covering, be it in biology or geosciences or computer science or chemistry, a lot of those principles are going to remain the same. Even though the technology changes, the fundamentals are often constant. So being able to teach those fundamentals so that students can then apply it given whatever technology they come upon is sort of critical and something that we center our curriculum in.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. I mean, one of the easiest examples is chemistry, obviously, right? So the periodic table in its basic form hasn't changed in many years. They keep finding new elements and they keep adding elements to the table, but those fundamentals are the same. So, but our software, for example, that we use to model chemicals, that we model interactions with chemicals, how different chemical structure might actually be uncovered. Now, all that continues to change and continues to have extreme movements forward as the years go by. But the fundamentals you have to know in order to be able to make that software do what it needs to do, that remains the same.
So when you look at your students, I mean, we'll be talking about this a moment from now, but this idea that a lot of people are say, overwhelmed by the technology, perhaps intimidated by it. Do you find that with students that you see, or are they really avid in going after it? And is there a way to, say, bring in students who might not think they are capable of dealing with this kind of technology?
Right. Most of our students, in fact, nearly all of them at this point, are essentially what we'd call digital natives, right? So the vast majority of students at Salisbury University have grown up with this inherent understanding of technology. What often gives them frustration, however, is a lot of times technology in the sciences is not nearly as user intuitive as, say, the iPhone that they grew up on, right? So a lot of times there is frustration trying to figure out sort of how to get the technology to do what in their consumer devices someone thought very hard about how to make that easy and ended up making it easy for them. Well, go ahead, sure.
Do you think that we don't pay enough attention to that then in some fields then, as opposed to the commercial?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's probably something to that. For the longest time, we have just assumed that students as they came along would just be able to naturally adapt to the technology because they'd grown up with it. And we do find there are some interesting challenges, though, still, because their understanding of it is, while very wide, perhaps is not particularly deep.
So give me an example of that kind of gap that you might have.
Well, a good example is, for example, within our computer science program. So in computer science, of course, we have the students not only learn a variety of computer languages, but how to apply those languages in some very specific contexts. Many students, however, when they come to major in computer science, they've been introduced to the topic through say, computer games or other sorts of, like I said, computer devices, and they are often challenged by the more structured, formal curriculum that you need to go through in order to now learn how the back ends of those devices actually work, how those systems are actually put together, because they've been dealing with the front end of them, for all this time.
So how difficult is that to then sort of peer beyond the surface of the phone or the device?
Right. It can be difficult. Now, we take great pains to try to get them there, right? We recognize that this is sort of the issue. But indeed, it really takes, from the student's perspective, it takes what we call a growth mindset, right? So being able to understand that there is something to learn. They have things that they need to approach when they get into a class. They are there to learn not only learn what they don't know, but learn what things might they need to learn that they don't know, right? So it's learn both the information and the holes in the information so they can go and fill those in. It's, like I said, it's a challenge.
So one of the things that I was wondering about is that, and when you teach these classes, is there a modeling effort? That is to say that, you learn models of things that are out in the real world, and that those then apply to what you're seeing, both obviously not only on the front end in terms of your phone, for example, or your computer, but also that then seem to make sense to make those connections. Because that's one of the ways that people learn, is to connect things they've already learned to new things.
Correct. Yeah. A classic example is engineering. In engineering, they'll use what's called a toy system. So this would be a much simplified version of a much more complicated piece of engineering. But the simplified version gives you enough it breaks it down into its component parts and gives you enough understanding of how the system works so that then you can learn it, take it apart, put it back together again so that you understand how it not only comes apart but goes together. And then you can take those principles and begin applying them to much more complex systems. So classic example is in meteorology. When you're teaching folks the circulation of the Earth, we actually end up teaching how to learn about the circulation of the Earth 3 different times. There's a way you learn it as a first-year student that is greatly simplified and is actually not really true about how it works, right? But the basic principles are correct. Then you learn it as a senior undergraduate, which is considerably more like how it actually works, but still is not exactly, but it's to the level that then you get to graduate school and they expose you to calculus and differential equations, and then you get into how it actually works. The trouble is you couldn't possibly try to explain that to a first-year student. They don't have the math background, but that's okay because they're building on that throughout their curriculum.
By the way, how important is mathematics in all of this? Because many people will look at it and say, I'm really not good at math.
Right. Yeah. No, mathematics is critical. I always like to say there's sort of a special place in heaven for mathematics teachers, particularly at the K through 12 level, because it is those folks that are creating the basis upon which these students can then go on and do a STEM curriculum. It is critical, and it's something we struggle with all the time, not only assessing where they are in their math skills, but then what do we have to do to get them up to the level that they need to be able to accomplish the more significant curriculum.
So in terms, by the way, of low-income communities of color, women, what are you seeing there? I mean, are you seeing an increase in the number of those students, and are there differences? What sense do you get about that?
Yeah, we do. We're very proud of the fact that Salisbury University was actually recognized as having the largest share of female computer science graduates, for example, in the country, which is really saying something. So we do have a fair number, and we see more all the time. What you find is a lot of those students are particularly motivated to do well. But having said that, depending on where they went to school, so what neighborhoods they came from, because in this country, of course, our secondary education is so closely tied to the neighborhood you grew up in. So if you grew up in a relatively wealthy neighborhood, you're going to have relatively good schools with relatively good background of math and science. And if you grew up in a neighborhood that didn't have all that, a lot of times your preparation isn't quite where it needs to be. So we've been putting a tremendous amount of effort into support structures like supplemental instruction, tutors, peer mentors, a lot of assessment throughout the course to make sure that you're on track in order to make sure that everybody has the best chance to succeed.
What about minorities? What do you see in there?
Right. So it's very similar. I mean, this is the largest group we know as they're working through, particularly here in the state of Maryland. Right. The groups that are growing the fastest demographically are minority groups, in particular our Hispanic population. So making sure that we are addressing whatever their needs are as they're coming in, speaking to the kinds of interests that they have, the application that they're interested in. But the good news is they're particularly motivated to do well. And so figuring out how to get them the skills they need in order to do well, that's what we're all about.
Now, you also have a program that there's an outreach to K through 12. Tell me a little bit about the outreach because obviously that is going to impact particularly a number of schools that we have, which have large minority populations.
Yeah, we do. So, for example, and there's a number of different programs that we're doing there. We've got a full-blown STEM outreach program where teachers from our local high schools will apply for funding if they've got an idea for an outreach program, and we'll help fund that through the Henson School. We've got our STEM Summer Academy that we're running this year. That is particularly for middle school students, and it is sort of above and beyond what you would normally get in your typical middle school science curriculum. But for students who are excited about science, it's just a great opportunity. And then we, meaning the faculty in the Henson School, will often go out to the schools to actually bring lessons to them and get students. It really gets students excited about what the possibilities are. It's not just the rote memorization of things. Science is all about discovery, and most people get really excited about the possibility of discovering new things.
And we'd be remiss if I mentioned the fact that right down the road we have the Wallops Island Flight Facility.
Correct. Exactly.
Which, tell me a little bit about what connections you may have with that and how you see particularly facilities like that encourage students to become involved in STEM.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have a ton of great relationships with Wallops. We have a number of alumni that work down there, which helps. So, and it's not just perhaps what you think. Certainly our computer science alumni, our physics engineering alumni down there, but also geography, geoscience. They've got quite a meteorology program down there with NOAA. So between NASA, NOAA, the Navy, the contractors at Wallops, there's a lot of collaboration. We have a number of endowed internships that run down there. So students can apply for those internships and then work with NASA engineers on a variety of different projects, usually over the summer, but we also do some during the school year.
So as you look forward, what kind of future is there in terms of STEM and how, I mean, we expect it to grow. I mentioned, I think earlier that there's like 3 times the growth in at least the first decade of the 21st century. How do you see that developing, and are some of us going to be left behind?
Well, I hope not. That would be our goal, not to. It is a huge growth area. We simply are not, and this is not just true for the state of Maryland or the Eastern Shore. This is true for the country. We are not creating enough young people who can interact with and drive the next generation of technologies and science. And just because the opportunities are so significant. So there's going to be plenty of room for everybody, I would suggest, going forward.
Do you think there'll be a digital divide?
I think there always is a bit of one, but the good news is our digital technologies continue to evolve to be even easier to use. So the good news is a lot of very advanced technology is now available in the palm of your hand. That actually helps break down that digital divide.
So you think that, of course, those people who are devising those devices, they obviously will then begin to shape the world we live in that we may not understand, I guess. So,
yeah.
And algorithms, as a matter of fact, is probably the most significant, with obviously social media and so on. But that underneath that social media are those hidden forces that we don't see.
Oh, this is one of the reasons it's so critical for us to do what we can to try to encourage groups who have not traditionally been part of the STEM workforce. It is absolutely critical that they are part of the solution, because those algorithms, if they are built by people who are sort of always the same old folks, right, that have the same old prejudices, when we look at it, artificial intelligence, this is actually a major issue. A lot of artificial intelligence research right now has been shown to have the implicit biases of course, the people that built the software in the first place, right? So getting more and different and a diverse set of voices into those entities, you're going to get a more diverse product and more diverse technology coming out the other side. It's absolutely critical.
We've been speaking with Dr. Michael Scott. He's the Dean of Henson School of Science and Technology and oversees the field, the STEM field, and here on the campus of Salisbury University. Appreciate you stopping by and talk with us.
Thanks very much.
When we think of the typical computer geek, it's often of white males hunched over their keyboards exploring the mysteries of 21st century technology. Cassidy Puckett has found that the talent and interest is not confined to such a small group. In her new book, Redefining Geek Bias and the 5 Hidden Habits of Tech-Savvy Teens, she looks at how digital talent and skills are found in diverse groups. And we have her on the phone this morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So tell me a little bit about how you came about to teaching, particularly kids who are particularly in minority groups, so young girls, and how did that come about? Because I think you were teaching, in Oakland is what I thought I saw.
Yes, Oakland, California, in a small public middle school in the Fruitvale in Oakland, and most of my students were Latinx students from immigrant families, low-income families, and we had a very rich and vibrant community there, Urban Promise Academy. And I was teaching technology classes, so web design and robotics, just based on my own interests, and was getting some training in that and then teaching my students. But I noticed that some students would struggle while others would take to it really well, and I couldn't figure out why. And I also wanted to know, all right, how do I get my students what is the goal for my students? How do I get them to be good with technology? All of them, even the ones who are doing fine. Where do they need to go? And the ones who are struggling, where do they need to go? They were all interested, so that was the big challenge. And at the time, this is the early 2000s, and at the time there were, and there still are, lots of ideas. So I looked to all kinds of standards that existed then and still exist today. And they gave me lots of ideas, and I thought, oh my goodness, what do I do with all of this? Because none of them seem to focus on the process of learning, even though we know that technology changes, right? That's like the core aspect of technology, is that it's constantly changing and we have to adapt to it. And that really wasn't helping me to figure out, okay, how can I best serve my students?
Well, in terms of teaching, why do you think it is that there's so much focus on processes as opposed to, say, how to learn things? I mean, and it goes just simply beyond certainly technology. I've seen that in other fields as well.
Yeah, so there's this funny thing that happens, which is like, all right, well, teach a kid PowerPoint or teach a kid Microsoft Word. And you think to yourself, okay, but is this going to help someone in the long term? And the technologies that were around when I was a kid are not the same as the ones that are around today, right? And every day they're changing. So there is this big pushback from teachers. Well, how important is this? And even from researchers and evaluators and people who do assessments, it's like, well, what are we assessing them on? It's not exactly the same as learning how to add or subtract, right? Or learning how to read. It's a different kind of learning because it's changing. And so what I needed to do was really figure out a way of how do I capture that and figure out what the core of being good with technology really means. And to do that, I had to study people who are really good at it.
So a couple of the methods you talk about, willingness to try and to deal with frustration and boredom. Tell me then a little bit about those, because oftentimes those applied obviously to many fields, but particularly to this kind of field because it is so technical and it does change so often. And you can learn one program, say in 1 month, and a year later it changes because it's been upgraded or there's something new that's going on.
Yes, absolutely. It's frustrating when you're, learning one operating system and then you have to switch to another one or a new phone or a new this or a new that. So that is definitely the core of what I'm trying to get at. So what I did was I went to, not just the experts in technology fields. They represent only a very small slice of the population of people who are really good at technology, and I knew that because I, was teaching, and I knew about award-winning programs all across the country that were teaching tech-savvy teens to do all kinds of creative things with technology, and they were much more diverse than experts in technology, in industry. And so what I did was I went to these programs. I studied about 100 teens, and I looked at what is it that they how they think, act, and feel that helps them in the learning process. And as you mentioned, what I landed on in that empirical study was 5 technology learning habits that help you in the learning process. Every time you encounter something new or a new way of using a technology that you're asked to do, you would use these habits, or these tech-savvy teens would use these habits in the learning process. And 3 of them are habits that can help in any area of learning, but they look a particular way with technology learning. And so I describe all that in the book. And so the first one is a willingness to try and fail. And that's very common in any kind of learning that you're doing. You have to be willing to try and fail. But with technology learning, it's actually a celebration. It was amazing to watch these kids. And, of course, the programs make it a safe place to fail. But it's like, look at me. Look at how terrible I did. It was just every single attempt was framed as a success. And then the second habit is managing frustration and boredom, because that's always going to happen as you're learning any kind of technology. And for that, it looked really interesting because, I was talking to a kid, and you're going to have to excuse my language, but he said, you go in with the expectation that you're going to suck. You're just going to be terrible. And that is actually not an indication that you're bad at technology learning, but actually you're good at it because you're doing just as you're supposed to do. And then they would do things like framing it as a game and sort of figuring out which parts, all right, I suck here, but I'm doing better there, and they would sort of like figure out their way through it. So managing their frustration and boredom. The third habit is using models, so people or information as models in the learning process. And then the last 2 habits are ones that I argue are technology specific. So those 2 are design logic, so that's thinking about why a technology is designed the way it is, and then how that relates to what you want to do with it. And then the final one is something I call efficiencies, and that's shorter ways or faster ways of using technologies, things like keyboard commands. So I didn't think that was very, I knew about that, but I didn't think it was very critical for technology learning. Turns out that is the major thing that tech-savvy teens are doing. They're sharing these little tricks, and they're showing each other, and they know when someone's good at something because they have the secret little trick that they do.
So now you taught, obviously, many minorities, Latinos, African Americans, and obviously young girls. What things did you observe about their own habits and what their own expectations were? Because oftentimes there is a sense that if you're a minority of some kind, then maybe you might aspire to something else other than, say, a high-tech job.
Yeah, so one of the things that I wanted to know was how do these habits vary by race and class and gender? And one of the most interesting things, and one that definitely complicates our ideas about the digital divide, so what I did was I made a quantitative scale that I call the digital adaptability scale, and that's in the book. It's 15 items. It asks people to report which of these habits they use and how much they use it. And so that showed me, when I did this big survey in Chicago of 8th grade students there, what it showed me was that there were actually no significant differences by race, ethnicity, or social class. There were some differences by gender, and those were in the 2 technology-specific habits, design, logic, and efficiencies, but there were no racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic differences, and that's not what we would expect from ideas about the digital divide and lower-income kids or the people who are not well represented in tech fields, that they sort of lack skills. What that showed me is that we're really not recognizing and rewarding the talent that they have. So that was very different from the kinds of things that we often hear about the digital divide.
Because one of the things that strikes me, and I think you make this reference in your book, is that there's a certain access if you're, say, affluent as opposed to not being affluent, or if, for instance, you come from poor schools or that are underfunded, for instance, in which you might not get this kind of teaching, that certainly must have an impact as these students go forward if they're not exposed to, say, for instance, the kinds of strategies that you've decided to design.
Well, what's interesting is that these kids, there aren't differences by race or class. So what that suggests is they are getting some opportunities, maybe after-school programs, maybe it's through gaming, for example, that might expose them to the kinds of habits that I've identified. Now, in school, though, they might not, that knowledge, schools certify your knowledge, so they might not be getting that kind of certification that they actually do know something. And, of course, there isn't the more advanced opportunities in lower-income schools is often the case, although not always. And so, these kids, they're ready for more is what I'm seeing. And that's different from saying, oh, they don't know anything, right? Actually, they know a lot. They just haven't been given the opportunities to do more with it. Quite frankly, yeah. Oh, sorry.
Well, can you give me an example? I know you have a reference to a lot of students in your book. Can you give an example of a student that seemed to rise to that?
Yes, absolutely. My favorite example, I was embedded in this low-income school in Chicago, and there I was following 4 kids there. I was there for a month, and they were really, mostly focused on testing when they did have a computer teacher, and kids did have a weekly class, so they were getting some exposure, but not really intensive, and it was mostly focused on test prep, their computer class. And so there really wasn't a lot of technology learning at the school that was happening. But in addition to that, there were some kids who actually had real talent who just weren't being identified by their teachers. And one day I was standing in this line with these kids who were waiting to go into science class, and we were just kind of standing there, and they were talking to me about the study. They knew that I was interested in technology and the people in their school who were, both interested in technology and not. And someone said to me, well, why aren't you following Tomas? I said, Tomas? I was very confused because he was the kid who was coming in late to class and who was kind of disruptive, or he was missing class, and he was standing in line, and I turned to him, and he said, yeah, at home I'm programming in C. And it was such a shock. It was a shock to me because he had not been identified by teachers. So really the thing is, we don't know, just by looking at a kid, we don't know what they're capable of. And so I'm hoping some of the tools that I provide in the book will help us into, better identifying what are the things that kids need and which kids are really ready for a lot more.
Finally, in terms of aspirations, you refer to aspirations at higher aspirations as opposed to realistic aspirations, and students are often taught to shoot for the realistic, not the high. What about that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I found in my study is that that their aspirations in technology fields and pursuing technology learning further in their educational pathways was related to the habits that they develop. It makes a lot of sense. If you're good at something, you're probably going to aspire to it, right? And so, but it's hard to build those kinds of aspirations without showing kids, you're good at technology, look at what you're doing. Because a lot of kids don't quite realize that the habits that they use in the learning process really is what it means to be good with technology. They themselves don't know. So it's important to give them that definition, to show them that they're good at something, and that's going to help them with their long-term goals and really with these kind of inequities that we see in STEM fields. Now, we also, of course, need to change the culture of those fields that pushes them out, that doesn't see their talent. And so that's another part of what I argue in the book. And that equity, that greater equity in STEM fields is really going to be for the benefit of all of us, because as the pandemic has shown us, the challenges that we face are quite large. So we need everyone at the table.
We've been speaking with Cassidy Puckett. She has written a new book entitled Redefining Geek, Bias, and 5 Hidden Habits of Tech-Savvy Teens. We appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Thank you so much.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.